My name is Sarah Mosky. I am the program coordinator at the Institute for LGBT Studies at the University of Arizona. And I'm going to be responsible for our housekeeping and introduction piece of the evening tonight. First thing is this event is being recorded. And so please make sure that you are, whatever you need to do to be comfortable with that. If you want to have your camera on or off, feel free to do that. And then it will be filmed in speaker view, which means Rachel will primarily be the one on the screen, but during the Q&A, you might be on the screen as well. So decide if you want camera on or off for that. Please remember to stay muted as we go through the event. If you have trouble staying muted and I notice, I can just help you out with that. So know that I'll be keeping an eye out for that. I've said it and I've put it in the chat as well, but just in case you missed it, captioning is available. If you go to the ... more on the bottom of your screen and select show subtitles, you'll be able to get captioning. And yeah, so tonight's event is the last in our series of a collaboration with KXCI, and I'm so excited to be here with Rachel doing this. And so the event has been 4 different events about different LGBTQ music eras or musicians throughout the 1900s. It's all been 1900s so far, which sounds like it was really long ago, but feels like yesterday in my mind. And then I'm going to go ahead and introduce Rachel for us. So tonight we have Rachel, I'm going to try to get it right. Hoblitt. Okay, I'm working on it. Rachel Hoblitt, who is a KXCI producer and Pima Community College professor of musicology and ethnomusicology, as well as a subject matter expert in American popular music at Pima. She is the host of Jazz Sunday, which airs Sundays from 12 to 3 p.m. weekly, which takes you on a weekly adventure through the audio files of KXCI's Jazz Library and explores the varying types, styles, and artists of American and international jazz. And so the floor is yours, Rachel. We're excited to have you here.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you to everyone for showing up today. I appreciate having an audience. As Sarah has mentioned, right, I'm a professor at Pima, and Sarah knows this because she also works at the U of A. When you're teaching in the age of COVID, you're basically teaching to a blank screen when no one talks, even though you have a class full of students. So it's nice to have some faces here, absolutely. So today, let me go ahead and share my screen and let's go ahead and get started. All right. So today I am going to go ahead and talk about the Queen of Disco, Sylvester. This is a person whose light shone so incredibly bright. And then as so many, queer folks in the 1980s, unfortunately had that, diminished significantly. But this, I'm going to talk about his life story, the music, how he got into showbiz, and how he kind of navigated a music industry that was not, and still in many ways is not as open to queer people as it should be, despite their many contributions to American popular music over many, many, many decades. Okay, so to get started, Sylvester was born Sylvester James Jr. in the Watts section of Los Angeles on September 6, 1947. And he was the oldest of 6. He had 3 brothers, 2 sisters. Early on in life, it was very apparent that Sylvester was gay. And that, of course, did not sit well in an overly masculine African-American community in essentially South Central Los Angeles at the time. And he and his family, specifically his mother, was very, very religious. And they were all members of the Pentecostal church and regularly went to church on Sundays at the Palm Lane Church of God in Christ in Los Angeles. But as part of this, and as part of so many African-American artists that grew up in the church, that's where they got their vocal training. And of course, Sylvester was a part of the church choir and was regularly performing, but it became very apparent early on that Sylvester was far more effeminate than the other male singers, and these church appearances and his outwardly queerness ended up being a big aspect of talk within members of the church. Now, as was the case, and as is frequently still the case in African American communities, especially for African American males, there were several members of his church that were predated on Sylvester sexually, and he was sexually assaulted by several members of closeted members of the church in his youth, and instead of putting blame, of course, on the people who were on the folks who were actually the actual sexual predators, of course, the church whispered and gave blame to Sylvester himself for being overly effeminate. So as such, he left the church at the age of 13. He was still relatively religious and considered himself a Christian throughout his life, but he was not interested in being a part of that anymore. Now, this, of course, led to some significant dysfunction at home. And his mother, Letha, had several suitors. Sylvester's original father, Sylvester James Sr., was not around. He left not long after two of his brothers were born, and it was the final, the last husband that Letha ended up marrying was far more strict about his sexuality, especially as he was getting into his teenage years. Now, they ended up fighting a lot, and there was a lot of dysfunction and anger at home. Although with his sisters, he was, considered this an older sister to his two younger sisters in a way, and did hair, did makeup, helped his sisters stone shoes and buy dresses and things like that. However, his grandmother, Juju, was a blues singer in the LA area in the 1930s. And of course, as so many of us that are involved in the music industry, myself included, are aware, there are queer people aplenty in the music industry and the performing arts. And she knew several gay men who knew from a very early age that Sylvester was gay. And she was essentially his rock in a way. And, after he got kicked out of the house at the age of 15, he went to go live with his grandmother and with several other, queer African-American teens in the area, but mostly his grandmother who gave him significant support. And it was his grandmother, Juju, that ended up pushing him towards groups of other queer teenagers. And this group and subsequent attempts to kind of copy gang culture, specifically in the LA, South Central LA area at the time, formed a group of queer Black teens called the Discotees. And they, due to their incredible affinity for late night partying and hostessing specifically, they were friends due to one of their individual members with Etta James, the blues artist and singer herself. Now, the Etta James had someone who would watch her house that was, I believe her name was Miss Foxy, if I remember correctly. Yes, Miss Foxy, who was friends with members of the Discotees, and would, when Etta was out touring or doing whatever, would have them come over, and they would host these incredibly lavish after hours dance parties, and they would get into full drag and go and be these hostesses, and they would go and do sing-offs and also other sorts of aspects of performance. Okay. Now, he ended up, the persona that he took on when he was doing this teenage drag as a drag party hostess was Dooney. And that was his kind of childhood nickname. Like very few people in the area of Watts where he grew up knew him as Sylvester. He was known as Dooney. And they ended up, these discotheque parties that they would end up hosting were very well subscribed, and straight people, queer people, people of color, they were very well subscribed by not necessarily Los Angeles's elite per se, but LA's party scene. Now, in 1969, when Sylvester was 21, because he bounced around quite a bit, he ended up not graduating high school until he was the age of 21. And by that point in time, a lot of these members of the discotheques had decided to either start transitioning, or several of them went into prostitution. Sylvester never went into prostitution, even though that was very common amongst queer African Americans, especially those who did drag. But he ended up, walking away from that lifestyle in 1969 and adopted a more kind of androgynous look during the daytime, right? The stuff that he did with the discotheques was after hours, was stuff that he did after, his grandma Juju fell asleep. So he would have a little bag with wigs and heels and tights and makeup and dresses outside of his window. And once the last plane arrived into LAX, because that was the part of LA that he was living in, he would end up opening the window to be able to go out and go do his party. And he would always come back before the first flight would arrive back into Los Angeles in the morning. But this ends up stopping at 21. And he, despite the laws that were in regards to female impersonation and female presentation for men during this period of time, he went out a lot in full drag as a teenager and would go, take the bus somewhere or go shopping, things like that, in full drag, knowing full well what the consequences were. There we go. So the discotheques break up, but in 1969, but he's clearly enamored with this, okay? And he decides, he ends up going and seeing a show at the Whiskey A Go-Go, the legendary club in Los Angeles, in the beginning of 1970, and meets a young man a young African-American who was doing work with a kind of experimental group of drag artists and performers up in the San Francisco area known as the Cockettes. The Cockettes, of course, Sylvester was one of the more famous members of Cockettes, but the Cockettes also was kind of a training ground for legendary drag artist and John Waters' muse, Divine. And she ended up doing had a lot of her theatrical and performance training as part of the Cockettes initially. Now, the Cockettes was a very kind of controversial and psychedelic era fueled group. Okay, plenty of drugs, plenty of LSD and hash, and surreal performances. But a good portion of the crop of a performing elite across the country were fans of the Cockettes and the work that they were doing in San Francisco. In 1971, the Cockettes ended up doing a tour in New York City, and ended up, the premiere for that particular tour was extremely well subscribed by some of the biggest names in entertainment: Andy Warhol, John Lennon and Yoko Ono, Liza Minnelli, Truman Capote, Gloria Vanderbilt, etc. And many of them were huge fans of the Cockettes and the kind of work that they were doing. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and show, before I get into the Sylvester and his hot band, so when he finally breaks into the music industry, I'm going to show you a little bit of a clip from a short documentary that was done by the BBC a few years back.
he began to dress as a woman. Eventually, he drifted north to San Francisco.
I think he was drawn to freedom and to the sense that in San Francisco, people were living out their imaginations. And that's how he always wanted to do things. He fantasized himself, and then he wanted to live that fantasy.
Fish gotta swim, birds gotta fly.
He teamed up with a group of outrageous hippie drag artists called the Cockettes. He joined the show, impersonating female blues singers.
This was Billie Holiday and Diana Ross on LSD.
But Sylvester stood out from the group.
Sylvester was probably the most talented one in the Cockettes at the time. He could get out there and sing, and everyone stopped, and it became almost serious to watch his performance.
So the onstage persona that that Sylvester created as part of his performance, as part of the Cockettes, was Ruby Blue, and that was his drag persona. And as you can see, he was impersonating female jazz and blues singers, specifically African American jazz and blues singers. Now, towards the end of the original run of the Cockettes, towards the end part of 1971, especially after they got to New York City, it ended up being the group themselves ended up being in this crazy drug-fueled, borderline hedonistic approach to their performances, and their performances started to suffer quite tremendously, to the point where Sylvester, who never really participated too much in this, although he did have some drug use, but nowhere near to the level as a lot of other folks who used drugs during the psychedelic era. He ended up apologizing before the Cockettes would go on stage about what they were about to see. So he's apologizing to the audience ahead of time, which of course is never a good thing in show business. Now, they returned to San Francisco. He leaves the Cockettes and returns to San Francisco in the beginning of 1972. And he was noticed by one of the co-founders of Rolling Stone magazine, Jan Wagner. And Jan Wenner, and he pushed Sylvester to go ahead and have an audition with A&M Records. And he ended up doing this audition with A&M, and they weren't super impressed with him. And they were, but A&M was doing him absolutely no favors by creating this band behind him, this group behind him, of white cishet males. Okay. And so, there was just not a cohesive understanding of the kind of music and performance and background that Sylvester had before going into this. Now, David Bowie, he actually, Sylvester and his hot band, so this is before he ends up signing to Fantasy, ends up opening for David Bowie in San Francisco. And David Bowie was actually a big fan of the stuff that Sylvester was doing, even though he had not had any sort of semblance of commercial success. And A&M, like I said, A&M Records was not doing him any favors. So he ended up having that kind of early promotion, dare I say, and acknowledgement for the kind of talent that he was curating in these early years. Now, the music that Sylvester was doing with the hot band was more rock oriented, and that was in a part kind of why it wasn't clicking and it wasn't that successful for him. And part of that had to do with the fact that in reality, he should have been doing something a little bit more closer to disco, which of course he does get into later, which I will talk about in the next slide. Disco, for those of you who are, I'm sure plenty of you are familiar with disco music. You've heard it before. It's been in commercials, movies, you name it, right? radio, what have you. But the history of disco and why disco has long been so controversial amongst Middle America anyway, was because it came specifically out of African American, Latino American, and queer club and dance scenes in urban areas, okay, specifically in the late 1960s. And the reality of disco was that it was the urban ethnic alternative to corporate rock music, which by the middle of the 1970s was really being pushed on radio stations all over the country. All right. But for folks who lived in New York, who lived in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, there was an acceptance of rock, but it wasn't what people wanted to listen to in clubs or dance to, right? And the thing, disco has always approached their music and lyrics with very risque subjects. And a lot of that had to do with the coinciding of the sexual liberation of America and changing attitudes in America at the end of the 1960s and into the 1970s. Now, so for example, Donna Summer's 1979 hit "Bad Girls," right, which talked about prostitution, which would not have flown prior or frankly after. Now, because of where this music started and the fact that it grew out of the club and dance scenes in urban areas, dance was absolutely at the forefront of disco, being performed by both white and African American artists, but heavily reliant on funk backgrounds and usually at around 120 beats per minute, give or take, right? That is, always a good tempo to dance at, but it was the majority of disco songs usually ran between about 117 and 130, give or take. All right, so Sylvester wasn't happy with with the hot band by any stretch of the imagination, and towards the middle part of the 1970s, so once he gets to like 1974 or so, him and his manager try to reconfigure how his background artists, and the hot band part of Sylvester and the hot band ended up leaving and going off to do their own act without Sylvester. And his manager had auditions, but he was performing with black drag queens for backups to kind of emphasize his queerness, but it wasn't until they had open auditions in 1974, later part of 1974, and a young woman by the name of Martha Wash showed up to go ahead and do an audition. And she came in and like Sylvester, grew up in the church, grew up with gospel music and rhythm and blues, and had the sound that Sylvester was really excited about, and pulled her aside and said, "You're really fantastic. Do you know of any other plus size women like you that would be willing, that are great singers as well?" And she said, "Oh yes, I know Azora Rhodes." And Azora came over, did a quick audition, and Sylvester and his manager brought the two on as the 2 tons of fun. Now, Martha and Azora, as you probably well know, ended up going on to be part of their own group, the Weather Girls, and had their own tremendous dance hit and queer anthem, "It's Raining Men." But they ended up working and did gigs around the Tenderloin area, mostly of San Francisco, because the Tenderloin, even, well, although I haven't been up there since San Francisco in a few years, Tenderloin's always been relatively seedy. And, because of that, it was a great place for creativity, much like CBGB in New York for the punk and new wave eras. Now, he ended up working with Patrick Cowley, who was from back east, but came out to the University of San Francisco to do to get a degree in music and start doing work in specifically with synthesizers, because that's what he was interested in. And Patrick Cowley worked with Sylvester on quite a few of his songs as a gay man himself, but was really a pioneer in synthesizer work before the widespread release of the Yamaha DX7, which in 1983, which was the big the big step forward in synthesizer technology and lowering in price that ended up making synthesizers kind of the quintessential sound of the 1980s. But the collaboration with Patrick Cowley as a composer and as a performer was something that Sylvester, his friendship and collaboration with Cowley lasted until Cowley's death and from AIDS-related illnesses in 1982. Now, the group ended up having regular gigs at the Palms Club on 1406 Polk in the Tenderloin. And it was at the Palms, which they ended up doing performances there, when a woman by the name of Nancy Pitts came in and saw the group performing one day. And she, of course, was married to Harvey Fuqua, who was in charge of Fantasy Records, which is based over in Oakland, and was a former Motown producer himself. So he was, Motown in the 1970s was heavily oriented towards disco, as that was, what was the popular music, at least towards the end of the decade. And, because with artists such as the Jackson 5, for example, and some of the work that Stevie Wonder was doing towards the end of the 1970s. Now, Harvey Fuqua ends up signing him to Fantasy Records in 1977, and then the same year released Sylvester's third album total, his first on Fantasy, the self-titled Sylvester, which I have the cover sitting here. Now, as you can kind of see, this is not exactly the flamboyant Sylvester that we all know and love, and this is highlighting kind of a major issue in regards to the music industry that is something that when I teach, I talk extensively about, is that a lot of artists, when they first break out and finally try to get into and have mainstream success, the first album or first couple of albums are usually pretty milquetoast and safe, right? It's only after an artist is able to establish a large fan base and saleability that artists are really able to kind of break free and do the music that they really want to do. I mean, a great example of this, of course, is Lady Gaga and her first couple of albums in 2007, 2008, and then eventually she starts doing work with Tony Bennett and getting more experimental with her artists. It's the same thing with Sylvester. And Harvey Fuqua wanted, and with this first album was R&B focused, so it was more so the rhythm and blues, more so the kind of the classic soul music that Sylvester was familiar with. I mean, grew up with it, listened to it, but it was not necessarily the kind of music that I think he wanted to do. And as such, as part of his promotions and things like that, he ended up with a more masculine look as opposed to the more androgynous looks that he was well known for doing later in life. However, Fantasy Records allowed him distribution, and that was absolutely key. Okay. So although Sylvester, the first album was all right, it had some moderate success. It was the 1978 album, Step 2, that allowed him to have the success and the mainstream recognition that we all know of today, right? Now, this was his fourth album, second overall for Fantasy, but with a very heavy disco influence. Okay. Now, the buildup to this album in 1978 was actually quite impressive because he was gaining recognition in the San Francisco area from the work. By this point in time, him and the Two Tons of Fun were working at the Elephant Walk Bar in the Castro, doing Sunday afternoon performances. He had tried out for film, for cameo in a film with Bette Midler, and got it. So he had been in movies at this point. But this was all setting him up for, mainstream success and name recognition. Now, there were 2 songs off of this album in particular, 2 singles that were released before the rest of the album was released. And that was, of course, Dance Disco Heat, which hit number 19 on the Billboard Hot 100, number 4 on the Rhythm and Blues charts, and number 1 on the dance charts. And arguably his best known song, You Make Me Feel Mighty Real, which on the Hot 100 hit number 36, Rhythm and Blues charts, number 20, and number 1 on the Billboard dance charts. Now, You Make Me Feel Mighty Real, which we're going to watch a little clip from American Bandstand from 1978 of him and the Two Tons of Fun performing both of these songs with a short interview in between. It was a delightful combination of disco and that kind of funk, underlying funk beats with gospel and rhythm and blues, right? Which, once again, this is the background of both Sylvester and the Two Tons of Fun. Plenty of falsetto, as he was very well known for, but this was the album that showcased who Sylvester was as a musician and as an artist. Okay. It was also one of the first songs to use a tremendous amount of electronic instrumentation and electronic effects. And once again, this is largely due to the work that he was doing with Patrick Cowley specifically. Okay. So this is a clip from American Bandstand, which aired on ABC. This was from December 9th, 1978. And they were doing a kind of closing out the year with disco. And it'll be Disco Heat, and then a short interview, and then You Make Me Feel Mighty Real.
A salute to the disco scene of 1978. It would not be complete without an outrageous gentleman and 2 friends. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Sylvester! I told you it was probably going to get a little strange in here. Animals, quiet, I say, quiet. Sylvester, please do me a favor. Introduce the ladies. Who is this lady
Miss
here?
Martha Wash, here, soprano, and Miss Izora Rhodes right here.
Izora, nice to see you. Martha, thank you. I have a terrible job. This is not very gentlemanly, but would you ladies take your microphones when you leave? Thank you, ladies, very much. Because
2 tons of fun.
2 tons of fun? Yeah. You could get killed, my man. What did you do? I read somewhere you got tired of seeing those skinny model-like maidens who couldn't sing, so when you saw these ladies, you said, yeah, that's it.
Well, you can look at them and tell they can sing.
Oh, I mean, immediate. Are they gospel background?
Oh, yes, we all are.
Where's your home?
Los Angeles.
No, somebody told me you're San Franciscan. Is that your adopted town?
Yes, 10 years.
Why did you leave set designing, clothing designing, and go full force into the music business?
There are people to do it for me now.
You don't have time to do your own stuff now?
I supervise a lot with it. The girls.
Why is San Francisco, and why has it always been a cultural center? What makes it so different?
It's a lot easier there.
Is it free city?
Yeah, a happy medium between LA and New York.
Yeah, you said somewhere in writing that LA is a role town. You got to play a role here, and up there you can be yourself.
That's true.
Be
I'm a
yourself.
little nervous about being here.
You are?
Yeah.
You're amongst friends. Oh, yeah? Right? This is the easiest job you'll ever have. You want us to do it? Second number? All right, he's over there waving frantically at me. What's the name of the next one?
You make me feel mighty real.
Ladies and gentlemen, Sylvester!
So as you can kind of see, right, you know, it wasn't necessarily that Sylvester painted himself or presented himself as overly feminine per se. It was absolutely androgynous in the way that he ended up performing. And as you could also probably kind of tell, he was, you know, he had some trepidation about coming back to Los Angeles and being on TV. But he was popular, and his music was extraordinarily popular towards the end of the end of 1978.
Salute.
Now, unfortunately, disco, not long after Sylvester's big arrival at the end of 1978, did disco finally start to decline. Okay, and criticism of disco, specifically by white working class cishet men, started to get to a fever pitch by the middle part of 1979, specifically of the event known as Disco Demolition Night, which happened at a Chicago White Sox game on the evening of July 12th, 1979, where 50,000 essentially corporate rock fans came to a doubleheader to destroy a bunch of disco records. But not only that, essentially destroyed the field and made every single bit of news. Disco was being criticized by being mindless, overproduced, and escapist, and a kind of a representation of the way that young people were looking at politics during this period of time towards the end of the 1970s, which of course ushered in the conservative 1980s, filled with homophobia, racism, and of course the religious right, which ended up putting a tremendous damper on disco. Now, he ended up releasing another album with one more disco album, Stars, in 1979 for Fantasy, and then ended up recording two more. But it was his last album with Fantasy Records, Too Hot to Sleep, which was from 1981, where they were trying their best to revamp Sylvester's career by having him go in a much different direction, even having him sing in a baritone voice, which was completely not Sylvester. But once again, as a queer person in the music industry, they were trying to salvage his image in the wake of the Reagan administration. However, but dance music didn't leave the gay community, and it certainly did not leave major cities across the United States. And specifically, a bunch of gay disc jockeys in San Francisco created labels specifically for their dance music after the fall of disco, and helped to create a new genre of dance music called high energy, spelled HINRG. Okay, and high energy has its roots in disco, of course, but the funk bass lines were largely gone by this point. But there was a greater emphasis on electronic instrumentation, and high energy kind of goes hand in hand with the new romantics era in the United Kingdom that was going on at the same time in the early 1980s. Now, Sylvester was not happy with how he was being treated at Fantasy, and how Harvey Fuqua was trying to change his persona and who he was, but also more importantly, Harvey Fuqua kept money from Sylvester for some of his performance dates, to the point where he would be, after the release of Step 2, would be doing performance spots and only be getting paid $500 for them, which for somebody who had reached the top 20 on the Billboard Hot 100, that shouldn't have happened. He was certainly due more money. Eventually, they settled, and he got about $20,000 back for that, but it still was not anywhere near enough. Now, in his move over to Megatone was owned by Patrick Cowley, right? Was one of the DJs that founded Megatone, and unfortunately, they had come back from a tour in Europe in 1981, and Cowley started showing signs of being very sick. And of course, at that time in 1981, they didn't know what HIV was. And he started getting progressively more and more sick. And they had no idea what was going on, what was wrong with him. But right before he passed away, Sylvester was able to get him out of the hospital and get him well enough to the point where he was able to go home and be at home for a bit before he passed away, and got him together to create "Do You Want a single? Do You Want a Funk?" which was released in 1982, and this was Sylvester's last really substantial hit. But this was also, once again, high energy as opposed to disco. Let's take a listen. So as you can kind of hear, right? I mean, this is a little bit quicker tempo, but heavy on the electronic instruments, heavy on the synthesizers, and kind of a precursor. And you could hear some of the influences with new wave, especially, and art pop and synth pop that was coming in the next couple of years with artists like Madonna and the Talking Heads. Now, unfortunately, as was the case with so many of the wonderful queer artists that were around during the 80s, Sylvester ended up contracting HIV after his boyfriend Rick Cranmer was diagnosed in the later part of 1986, in the early part of 1987, and rapidly deteriorated and passed away. But however, the music that he was recording after Do You Want to Funk, it really had minimal success, and it was not at the same popularity level. And that was, I think, partially due to the decrease in queer club culture as a result of the AIDS epidemic. However, before he did pass away, he had the wonderful opportunity to be recorded as a backup singer for Aretha Franklin, and but it was Patrick Crawley, his longtime collaborator's death in 1982, that really shook him and moved him to want to do more and more work with the AIDS epidemic, and did fundraising concerts. And that was where he honestly spent most of his time, even though, he was still releasing some music, but his focus was to help his community in San Francisco that opened up their arms for him all the way back in 1970. Now, once Rick Cranmer ends up getting really sick and passing away, it was pretty obvious that he was going to die too. And at the latter part of 1987 was diagnosed with HIV, and passes away on December 16th, 1988 at the age of 41. But that's not to say that his legacy was not without, that his legacy died with him, because by all means, it certainly did not. And he was able to, through the house music and high energy and disco that he made, and was able to have significant popularity as an androgynous figure, open the doors for other Black gay artists as well to have significant success. I mean, obviously, I can talk extensively about the New Romantics and what was going on in the United Kingdom, but it was really a whopping 4 years after Sylvester passes away that RuPaul's biggest hit, Supermodel of the World, was released and brought RuPaul to mainstream acceptance and visibility in the American society. And of course, from that point, of course, as you probably well know, has the mega hit reality TV series RuPaul's Drag Race in its 13th season, and tremendous acclaim. But that doesn't mean that the music that was being done was limited to that he was influenced. It was limited to house music and EDM in a sense. In the early part of the 2000s, or late 90s and early 2000s, a big hip hop scene of Black queer artists starts popping up in New Orleans, with artists like Katie Red and, most importantly, Big Frida. So I'm going to go ahead, and I'm not going to play Supermodel because I don't think there's very many people on the planet that have not heard this song before, but I'll play a little bit of New Orleans Bounce, NO Bounce from the artist Big Frida, who is referred to as She, and the sissy bounce music and she grew up listening to Sylvester at home and was born the same year that Step 2 was released. So here's a little bit of New Orleans Bounce. So bounce music and sissy bounce in particular is this one is kind of a hybrid between Southern hip hop and kind of an electric dance music, which once again goes directly back to the work that Sylvester did and the groundwork that Sylvester laid down for these artists. So, all right, well, that's all I have today. We've got about 5 minutes left, give or take. I want to thank everyone for coming in for this, and yeah, I'm open for questions, and if Sarah wants to go ahead and unmute herself and come back on, I guess that's fine as well.
So we do have one question in the chat. How does the family stone figure into this?
Okay. So Sly and the Family Stone was formed in 1966 in San Francisco, right? And was one of the first really gender and racially integrated major rock groups. But not only that, we're largely responsible for the proliferation of funk and psychedelic funk throughout San Francisco and then eventually across the world. The thing with Sly and the Family Stone was that they were broken up by 1970. Okay, so by the time Sylvester reaches San Francisco, they're already gone. And that was largely due to, to be quite frank, Sly Stone was not a great person. He got into a lot of fights. He was, did a lot of drugs and alcohol and fought quite aggressively with his members. But the groundwork was there, right? And obviously, the club scene in San Francisco and the performance scene in San Francisco, even from 1970 onwards, when a lot of the artists in the psychedelic rock and psychedelic era were dying of overdoses, there was a lot of leftover music and influence going on in that area. Absolutely, it's part of why the creativity drew Sylvester there to begin with. Any other questions?
I was the only one in the chat right now, but sometimes I give people a moment to formulate them. I don't know if you want to answer the question that was emailed that we had kind of been discussing beforehand.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'm happy to do so.
Yeah, so there was a question emailed, and I don't know if I see that person here, but the question was about, obviously you discussed that Sylvester had HIV or AIDS, even though he wasn't necessarily diagnosed with it. And they were curious if you knew if he underwent like active treatment for it. And I think you kind of covered a bit of that, but yeah.
The reality, yeah, yes, he was diagnosed, and once again, once his partner passed away, it was very obvious that he had had it. We're talking, you know, late 1987, early 1988. There was not much in the way of therapy that were available for the general public, and you know, the antiretroviral cocktails were not available. So he was basically resigned, because by this point in time, in 1987, him and so many others in San Francisco saw so many of their friends die. And it was, you know, he basically just had accepted his fate. So, and once things started getting really bad for him, when he started having more severe symptoms and problems towards November of 1988, he made up his will and started giving away some of his final things, and had said he was buried in a red kimono, because that's the kind of thing he wanted. So, okay, there's another question in the chat. New romantic music period was mentioned. Boy George and or Peter Burns. Oh, I'm guessing you're mentioning Pete Burns, not Peter Burner. Influenced by Sylvester, vice versa. Absolutely, yes. Boy George was heavily influenced by the work of Sylvester. Sylvester did tour in the United Kingdom at the height of his, well, earlier in his career and at the height of his popularity, towards 1979. And yes, he was widely welcomed in the United Kingdom. Probably, Gary, I would say more so than he was here, specifically amongst white audiences in the UK. Yeah. Any questions? Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Okay, so there is a question in the chat if Sylvester and Sly are the same person.
No. Sly, Sly, as in Sly and the Family Stone, was Sylvester Stone. Okay, Sylvester, the disco artist, was Sylvester James Jr., different person.
Cool, we can give it another minute for questions, but we are about at an hour. So I want to thank everybody who showed up tonight, and thank you, Rachel, for all the amazing information and the music and the video. The visuals were great.
You're most welcome. Like I said, I'm a professor of ethnomusicology at Pima Community College. I'm a subject matter expert in American popular music. I teach classes on the history of American popular music. So yes, if you are interested in more, my classes, it runs at Pima. So. Thank you.